Good afternoon, Africa. You're watching CNBC Africa, and welcome to the CNBC Africa World Economic Forum Road to Cape Town series of discussions. This is the first of three installments where we have a series of debates that are aimed at bringing Africa together. Our theme this afternoon is the Silicon Savannah, how technology and innovation is shaping the future of East Africa, with a special focus on inspiration and creating creativity in that. Well, this evening, to help me discuss this is a panel that is made up of people who know more about technology than I do. So without much ado, I'd like to introduce Karl Westvig. He is the Chief Executive Officer of AFB. Also, we have not known to technologists in this space, Juliana Rotich. She is a co-founder and executive director at Ushahidi, Kenya. And we have finally Bob Collymore, Chief Executive of Safaricom, man leading the most profitable company in East Africa. Welcome.
Thank you.
The conversation about technology in East Africa is a wide one, and we've had it in many places. But I think we need to start by painting the picture of where exactly we are, with what is the digital landscape as we speak now. I think I'll start with Karl.
So particularly in East Africa, you've been fortunate in that you've had pretty much a clean slate to work from. You're not held back by old technologies, which has allowed mobile to take over. And you've built an incredible set of rails on which you can put everything on top of that. So the skill sets that are being developed around those rails are quite something. And the innovation coming out of East Africa can be used anywhere in the world. I mean, we see that already.
Mm-hmm. Juliana, we've come from a time where ICT was contributing just what, 9% to the GDP. We were doing in the regions of 12, 14. Are you happy with that as we discuss this landscape?
We can absolutely do more, and specifically about this landscape.
Right.
We're at a fantastic time to be in Africa and to be in East Africa. We're at a really good time. It's an opportune moment to not only be here, but to also build here. Whatever we're doing in terms of creating the space and expanding the digital landscape from not just software and the success that we've seen with mobile,
right,
but into hardware. I think that's where things can get a little bit even more interesting, where that percentage that we're contributing to the GDP could be even higher, right, when we add the number of jobs that are created in the totality of the digital landscape, because digital is not just software, it's also hardware.
Right.
Yeah.
Bob, this landscape has proven particularly profitable for your company. Are you happy with where we are?
No, not really. I think Juliana is being a little bit self-effacing, okay, because when she says that we could create more jobs, and let me declare my interest here. Juliana, I think, is one of the smartest people that I know, right, the smartest Kenyan I know, well, the smartest person I know. And she and her colleague, I'm being serious, she and her colleagues, have developed the brick, for example, and right, she doesn't want to talk about it here, but she's developed the brick. The brick has been sold to 4 to 5 countries. Now, it's cheaper for Juliana to make that brick in the United States than to make it here in Nairobi. The capabilities are here. And so, what is holding things back? I think it's the regulators across the countries, the African countries, taking a more holistic view of this stuff, rather than looking for short-term gains. The ICT sector is one which is really very easy to tax. Right. And I speak as the CEO of the most highly taxed company in the region. So it's very easy for guys to look at it and say, let's tax this thing. We look at other countries. You look at the DRC. The DRC, the taxation rate on ICT and mobile phones is ridiculously high. Right. And if you do that, then it's a disincentive for people to invest. It's a disincentive for people to manufacture. But if they took the holistic view and the longer-term view of the impact that ICT will have, and not just my company is profitable, which is great, but if they take a more holistic view, you can see the impact it would have on GDP growth, and then you invest in that rather than trying to milk the cow, right, before it's fully formed.
Right. What we're getting here is that there's an if we do this, we could be better. Let's try to paint that picture of where exactly could we be, Juliana?
We could be in, I think we're seeing some of that happening already.
Right.
We could be in a time where, if you have children, that they have access to the type of education where they're learning robotics, they're learning programming, and we could be in a time where we even see more innovations. We often hear stories about innovation, much lauded M-Pesa, quite rightly actually, Ushahidi, the brick, and companies like Kopo, AFB, all these different things that are happening in East Africa. That's the story now.
Right.
We could be in a time where we could have even more stories that will blow our minds.
Right.
That we could. I do not want to compare that we would create X like the African Google. I don't want to say that,
right,
because
okay, say
that's presupposing,
right,
that company would be solving problems that Google solves. No,
right,
no. We're talking about companies that solve our problems in our context,
right,
and do it so efficiently and so well and so creatively,
right,
that we go, wow, I didn't know I needed this. Mm-hmm. But then it's part and parcel of life.
Right.
So we could be in a time where we just see more creativity and more innovation. Right. That's what we would like to move towards. If we have this holistic ecosystem environment that is conducive to creation and conducive to problem solving, we could create really valuable companies.
Right. There's a lot of could, and let's just get to who should do this, because Bob started by saying there's a lot more that the government needs to do in terms of regulation, and that's what it sounded to me. Let's talk about the innovators, because they're the people who brought us here today. And the conversation is, yes, you've cited BRIC, AFB and whatnot. There's concern that a lot of us are innovating for fun. We are innovating nice things. And when you talk about that, everyone thinks about the apps that we keep coming up with. How do we marry the need versus what we have there? Are our innovators applying themselves in the context and the need in which they operate in?
You only have to look at examples like M-Farm.
Right.
And, you know, there are a lot, obviously, like that point of view that all these apps that are being created, that they're just sort of for fun. Mm-hmm. Don't Africans have a right to have fun too? They
need to eat first.
Right?
Right.
Oh, absolutely. We need to eat first, and we need to respond to problems. Mm-hmm. We absolutely have to do that. But then let's look at this as holistically as possible.
Right.
There are apps in the entertainment industry. There are apps in the education industry, even some for agriculture, and different applications that solve different needs. So there needs to be more in terms of user testing.
Right.
So we've got a spin-off of a part of the iHub called the iHub User Experience Lab on the ground floor.
Right.
It helps app makers to make sure that they're bridging the gap between the need and the actual functionality of the application.
Right.
So yes, most of the applications that the successful ones are the ones that respond to a need. Mm-hmm. But I do not want to, I'd like to push back a little bit on the fun, right, because you've got a lot of children who respond to games.
Right.
And there are ways that you can provide educational content in a gamified way that can be entertaining, but also of educational value.
Right.
So I think let's be as supportive of all the applications possible.
Right. I just want to be a little bit more skeptical, and let me bring in Karl, because the question is, are our homegrown innovators meeting our needs?
I mean, certainly my experience so far has been that they talk about necessity is the mother of all invention. I think many of the solutions we have in East Africa are because of need. I mean, if you take M-Pesa, transferring money across different parts of the country. You take an M-Copa, where people are providing solar solutions using SIM card technology. So most is driven by need. And And I think you've also got sufficient needs here to create that innovation, which you aren't seeing in other parts of the world. If you take the developed markets, they're not innovating as much because everything exists, and they're stuck in a time warp to some extent. So, when you speak to developers, even on the west coast of the US, they don't understand how we get these things right and how we can apply them. So, I think if you look going forward, if you want to keep developing these areas, you need to create almost an open platform where there's collaboration. So, the more that the Safaricoms work with AFBs, work with the Ushahidis, who work with the banks, the more we work together collaboratively and use each other's rails, the more successful we become.
Right. We'll just get into that point because you're preempting where I'm heading. But Bob, are we contextually relevant in terms of what we put out there? Because, like Juliana was saying, there's a lot of there's a place where there's this calling of when do we get to create the next whatever you fill the gap with, and people talk of Facebook, of Google, and whatnot. Are we relevant to the needs of this market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we we tend to not see our homegrown successes. So, you know, she's here, so I'm not going to talk about the BRIC. But if she wasn't here, I always talk about the BRIC. Right. I always talk about Ushahidi. I always talk about Bridge International. I mean, in the audience here, let me ask how many people know and how much do they know about Bridge International? Bridge International Academies are opening a new school every 2.1 days in the slums. And it's a self-sustaining model, right? So parents in the slums are paying an average of about 570 shillings a month for a quality education. You know, it is delivered off ICT. The teachers have all got, you know, a Barnes & Noble tablet, and it's a very structured program. If I look at Sanergy, you know, Sanergy deals with a very, I don't know how many people know about Sanergy here. Bridge International, incidentally, started in Kenya, is now moving to Uganda, is now moving to India. And I'm going to try and get through this whole conversation without talking about M-Pesa, because M-Pesa is not the be-all and the end-all of the innovations which is coming out. I absolutely echo what Juliana says. Both good friends.
Yeah, big difference.
You know, you have to have fun as well.
Right.
And if we just keep ourselves just focused on need, it becomes as dull as hell. Right. And young people who are where most of the innovation is coming from ain't going to want to do it. But in amongst that, you will get some useful stuff. Do we want to create another Facebook or Google? No, not really. I mean, you know, Facebook and Google were created for different reasons. Right. WhatsApp was created for different reasons. We've got our own stuff. And if we keep doing this Facebook, Google, who wants to be the next billionaire nonsense, you know, we're going to end up with more and more failures. Right. I watched a great TED Talk the other day, which says that, you know, if you want your dream to fail, there are 5 ways. And one of those ways is to expect an overnight success. You don't get overnight successes. It just doesn't happen. Right. You know, the thing which seems to be an overnight success, the guy or girl had been working in some garage somewhere for 20 years. And suddenly, you know, she didn't get an overnight success with the BRIC. Right. She and her partners worked for a long time. And now suddenly you've got something which is world-beating. You know, I don't know if you've seen the product, but it's a fantastic product, being exported to 4 to 5 countries. Right. So don't go chasing after Google and Facebook. You know? Right.
Because there are people who argue that ultimately it's got to be about creating, let's not call them problems, creating opportunities, creating employment, creating a source of livelihood. And that's where probably this concern is coming from, that makes a lot of developers to focus on problems other than fun.
But fun actually solves a problem as well. Right. When last have you stood in a queue? And when you stand in the queue, what do you reach for? You reach for your phone now. Right. And you either play games or you do. So fun actually solves another problem. Huh? Right. Don't assume that fun isn't a solution for a problem. So that's also okay.
Interesting. You seem like you want to jump in.
No, I'm just completely agreeing. And you know, the part about innovation that is really important to remember is that fun also stimulates and includes people who are creative. And, you know, we can't expect to create solutions to our problems if we don't have creative thinkers. People who problem solve, but not in, they problem solve in a creative way so that you actually end up with a working solution. Right. So yeah, just to add that it has a link to creativity. Right. Yeah.
All right, let me just bring in a point that Karl introduced earlier on, though prematurely. Let's talk about that space of collaboration, because that seems to be something that is coming out every point we're talking about technology. There's need for people to come together, and when we talk about collaborations, we talk about iHub, MLab, NILab, and all the other labs on Ngong Road. But how do we ensure that other people participate in this? People like Bob Collymore, people who are running corporates, how do they get to be part of this? Because there is a concern that a lot of the people who are putting their efforts and time and money into innovation are not necessarily Kenyans or Africans for that matter.
So Bob has actually been a part of the ecosystem for a very long time. One of the first fireside chats, and these are inspirational talks that we have at the iHub with a series of luminaries from around the world, including Bob and the former CEO of Apple, John Scully, Vint Cerf, the elder of the internet. They happen at the iHub. So back to the question about collaboration. So just to make the point that there is a role for private, for corporates to be part of the innovation and tech ecosystem story, and they have been for the last 5 years. And the way that a lot of the corporates have worked, particularly with the iHub, is they've sponsored and provided much needed bandwidth that is sort of the lifeblood of a lot of app developers. So that's number one. The other thing that they've done is they've sponsored the space, so that you can actually have a location where you have this serendipity and the collaboration, or even just the meeting place where people can meet their co-founders and grow their company from a team of 3 to 10 to 20 to 40 until they have to leave the building and set up right next. And that's an example of Kopo Kopo. They started out at the iHub drinking lots of coffee, using the bandwidth that was provided by Safaricom and CCOM. So the point is, when you create a space for serendipity and collaboration, there is a role for corporates to engage, because innovation is not something that happens in a vacuum. It's not just for the young people. It's also for corporates. And we're talking about pipeline of talent for not just startups, but also for companies. They also need talent. They need the density of this talent, and they need the access to this talent. So I think the labs and all the stuff that is happening on Ngong Road, very nascent, but requires more support in order to continue creating that space for innovation in the years to come.
I think big companies are beginning to get there.
Yeah.
We weren't the first. So when we arrived at iHub, for example, people like Ericsson were already there. Ericsson, Samsung, Nokia. So all those guys are beginning to get it. And why? Because they can't afford to hire these people. Because you're going to have to hire tens of thousands of people. And in my company, we've only got just over 4,000 people. But, we're not going to have specialists in, coffee making machines. And so we've all figured out that if we want to get access to those guys, we have to go start in those spaces. What's going to be important for us is that we have to show some successes. Because if we just keep playing and nobody actually makes money out of this, except the big corporates, then of course it's going to stop.
Because that is clear, but do the corporates actually see or know their role? Karl, what do you see your role being in this whole collaborative effort?
So if you look at corporates in general, corporates tend not to innovate too much internally. Once you get big structures, any new idea that comes up has got to go through 10 levels of approvals and structures and all the rest. So,
as it should be.
Yeah, so you tend to look outside for innovation, and I think the iHubs are a fantastic place to go and find some of that. The Kopo Kopo example, so we end up working with Kopo Kopo on a product and developed a very successful partnership in the early stage with Kopo Kopo. And they came out of iHub. So I think what the corporates need to do is to reach out and to understand who's there, build relationships with them, understand what's available, because you tend to sit in your office and focus on your PC and read the Wall Street Journal.
What are these spaces they can fill in? What are these roles they can step in regards to collaborating with innovators?
So I think what you see in terms of an iHub, you see both product and you see skills. So in our case, there are certain products we might want to collaborate with, but more than that, there's skill sets. And as you're getting more and more into the mobile space, there's a different set of skills. And if you're dealing with USSD developments or app developments or whatever, you can't tend to hire teams and teams internally unless that's your core business.
Right.
So we'll then go and sit with the likes of the iHub and either find the skill sets or find product that meet what we need.
Right. There's a danger. I mean, we have to be careful we don't think of Silicon Savannah as a place, because it's not a place, it's a mindset.
Yes. Right.
And if we start to think that we have to go to iHub or we have to go to iLab or NILAB, then that's the wrong thing. It is a mindset. And
because I think that even makes it harder for corporates to see their role clearly in this. Because this is a wave that is coming and they need to ride it. They need to be part of it, yet they don't see where it's going.
But I think if we look outside of Africa, we see very good examples of how that stuff is working. And I come back to my old argument that I think as Africans sometimes we don't have a world view. When last did people go to the so-called Silicon Valley and talk to guys there? And if you start to do that, then you realize that, oh wow, Facebook, Cheryl and her team do talk with small guys, and eventually sometimes they buy those small guys. Right. If you go to Zurich or you go to Mountain View, you see that Google, one of the reasons for their success is because they deal with the small guys. And you speak with Google staff turnover, they'll tell you that they hire people several times. So they hire them, they're all mostly PhDs. These guys get big, they leave, they start their own company, Google buys them. Then they grow, and they would employ people 2 or 3 times.
Right.
So the big successful companies are the ones that are getting into that collaborative space, because the world is all about collaboration now.
Right. You've been doing a lot of work in this space for a long time. How do we point people like Karl into this space?
So there are 2 major ways. I think one of the things that has happened both with AFB and Safaricom and some of the other corporates is they reach out, but then we also reach out and we have a relationship. And the other thing that that can really help when it comes to corporates engaging with startups is provision of application programming interfaces, which leverages the existing platforms. So for example, there's currently an M-Pesa API that there's a process to be able to use that application programming interface so that you can create an application that leverages the M-Pesa system to add a payment system to an application, for example. So I think that bodes really, really well for the future of really interesting applications, mobile applications, because it solves a chunk of a problem. When you have a new customer, the customer has to see what it is you're offering. They have to be convinced that they need it or they want it. And then last but not least, and actually very importantly, there has to be a low friction way of them to buy what it is they've seen. And so application programming interfaces, supporting the ecosystem in terms of providing not only bandwidth, but also helping out with the operation of these locations of collaboration, I think is really, really important. The other thing that corporates can do is, like Bob said, acquire and work with companies, small companies that provide a specific service, not just to a corporate, but also to customers or even government.
Right. We'll take a pause there because we need to catch a quick break. But you're watching the CNBC Africa World Economic Forum round of the Road to Cape Town debates. We're discussing the Silicon Savannah, which way forward. We'll take a quick break, more after this. Welcome back to the CNBC Africa World Economic Forum Road to Cape Town round of conversations. As I said earlier, this is just one of the 3 installments. The next will be in West Africa and South Africa, and obviously, as rightly put, Road to Cape Town. Our theme this afternoon is Silicon Savannah, how technology and innovation is shaping the future of East Africa. On the panel is Karl Westvig, who's the Chief Executive Officer at AFB. We have Juliana Rotich, Co-founder and Executive Director, Ushahidi Kenya, and Bob Collymore, Chief Executive Officer, Safaricom. Gentlemen and lady, let's talk about the money, because it's all about the money. We can debate about how tech is good, how we need this and that, but it all boils down to the money. How do we monetize this? How do we join the dots in this, Karl?
I mean, the way we look at it, so we obviously have products that have margin. The biggest cost in our business is acquisition and then ultimately collection. We're in the lending business. What we do find with technology, and particularly mobile platforms, is it's a fairly frictionless platform. So we can deliver a product at next to no cost, and we can collect at next to no cost once you put all the structures in place. So certainly the technology facilitates our business significantly. Right. We don't need to have thousands of branches and thousands of outlets, et cetera, to service a market. We can service it directly.
Right. For the techies, Juliana, how do we join the money and innovation bit?
So this is the thing. Sometimes you have to start with a prototype, and actually, before you can get an investor, you need to put in the time and have something in hand that you can show, and then have some sort of adoption statistics, so that when you do talk to an investor, they can see the traction that you're creating, so that they can take a chance on you. And on this question of monetization, it also ties into capital and sources of capital. It took us quite a lot longer than we thought that it would take for us to come up with the seed round for the brick, for example. And people said, they've raised money for Ushahidi before, this should be easy. No, it was not. Right. And the three things that we needed to do more of, and which we did, was one, investor education. We actually had to explain more about the African context and the opportunity. Why are blackouts an issue? Why is ubiquitous mobile penetration an opportunity to leverage in creation of, to create a Wi-Fi network and extend connectivity? Right. We had to do a lot of investor education, and we had to look far and wide. We also looked internally. We talked to African investors, both local here in Kenya, some in Nigeria. I'm afraid to say that we have a long way to go in terms of African philanthropists actually investing in African companies that have some solid traction.
Yes, because
so there's more to be done.
A lot of African business leaders get is that this is CSR. This I do when I have a little extra money. So it's not really up there on the priority list. Bob, what's your relationship with funding or monetizing this?
Yeah, I mean, before I go there, I mean, let me make myself entirely unpopular with African money. Because here in Kenya, you would rather put our money in a piece of useless land than invest it in an enterprise. Right. And actually, when you then go to Silicon Valley, I was in Los Angeles last week, and you talk to serious money, guys who are talking about trillions of dollars. And you say Africa, and they say, well, what about Africa? They're very indifferent to Africa. So my urge is that African money needs to stay in Africa and needs to start to invest in things like this, in enterprise. Right. Because if we rely, and I hate the fact that you're starting to think about philanthropic money. It mustn't be about philanthropic money. Right. My company has just decided to put a Spark fund, a small venture fund, just to see how it goes. It's $1 million, it's not much money. But I would really want to see other companies come along and support, back up that kind of investment.
Is it because they don't see value in this?
I think we have a long way to go before African money, about individuals as well as companies, before African money really start to see the value in, not just this product, but similar products.
Right. Karl, what is the challenge in funding or investing in this? Because earlier on we talked about some of these companies being bought out. That is not so popular in Nairobi or Africa for that matter. What is so hard in African business leaders, investors saying, I want to put my money on what Juliana is doing?
So, our experience in terms of investors in Africa looking for opportunities, I'm talking potentially external investors from Africa. the one thing they're looking for is good governance. So there needs to be some structures in place.
Right.
And I think there needs to be an investment in the smaller enterprises to say, if you want to go and find money, you need to have good governance. So you need to have good set of books, you need to have a track record of some form, you need to have some sort of forecast, etc. So there needs to be some governance around it. The other thing that investors are looking for is they want scalable businesses. So and many of the external investors are in large economies, and if they invest in a South African type business, often the scale is too small. It doesn't move the dial. Right. So on a purely commercial basis, they don't get the value. So you need to prove their scale. You need to prove that you have good governance before you can start attracting money. Money is there. There are many funds and many people running around with funds trying to invest. Right. So I think you need to balance those three.
So basically the valuation is based on what? A dream?
Potentially a Google. I don't know.
but let me ask Juliana a question. Did you find telling that story easy? Was it easier that some of your partners were non-Africans and quite familiar with that space?
It wasn't easy, actually. It got easier with time. It's just that with each possible investor, first of all, we had to explain that, first of all, the scale of the opportunity, right. And how, because it's 2015, but frankly, brand Africa and brand Kenya, it doesn't tally with reality.
Right.
Because you're basically dealing with investors who have this view of Kenya and this view of East Africa and this view of Africa that is very different from the current reality that we know is one of opportunity and boundless creativity, right. So you have to explain that, and then you have to explain the context, the problem, the market, and how, and then you have to embody, obviously you embody that, but then it took a while before they saw that.
But still we have non-African money funding these initiatives.
Yes.
Isn't it ironic because the African leaders are in this space, they understand the situation that you're trying to solve. They should be the one top of the list saying, I want to be part of this.
It is changing.
Right.
We were at the Innovation Forum here in Nairobi, and the president actually bought the brick and right. is a champion of not only homegrown innovations, but right. then not just in the software industry, but also in the hardware industry.
Right.
So if that's just one example, but I think you've got other people who are starting to see opportunity. And to go back to Karl's point right. about scalable models, those companies that have scalable models and, like Kopo, right. And a few others, we'll need to see a few more exits. We need to see some really solid exits. And I think that is coming. And it's probably too soon to expect something because right. The industry has been there maybe, less than 10 years, really, if you look at it. Sort of the startup ecosystem has been around for about less than 10 years.
Right.
So it's still nascent, but in the next couple of years in the future, we'd like to see some solid exits. And I think that'll help convince investors that there's always risk, right? But let me take a chance on this. There's a possibility that I could make a big return. But we need some of those stories coming out.
What do you think we need to do as Team Africa now? What do we need to do to change that?
So first is telling more of these success stories. I know you don't want to talk about M-Pesa, but right. M-Pesa out there has changed how people view Africa right. and how people view Kenya. The Ushahidi story has changed how people view Kenya, how people view Africa. So I think telling more of those success stories, and two, creating links because talent, the talent pipeline for us here in Kenya and regionally in Africa is really, really important that we're investing in the next generation right. of developers, of business people, of project managers who are going to help us run these growing companies. Right. So not only telling the story of the successes now, but then attracting the best in the world to come work with us and to come work for us, because we are world class.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me just bring in Karl, because I was waiting for Bob to ask the next question now that he took my job. That seems, the responsibility here seems like it's coming on the part of the innovators. They need to do this, they need to do that. And what I heard Karl speak was about innovators need to value better, they need to have been in existence for blah, blah, blah. What is the role of, is there a space for proactiveness from the funders, from the people who can actually see this? Because we're not operating in a vacuum. They see these challenges. They should be able to see what we're developing. What is the role of the people like Karl and Bob in this space?
I mean, I can speak as a, as a corporate looking at the talent and what's out there. So we've made one fairly large, for us, acqui-hire in Kenya. And we needed certain skill sets, and it happened to be integration into the MNO networks. They had the skills to do it. And we were sitting, having discussions with people from XI Hub, etc., and saying, it's going to become so core to what we do going forward. We want them internally as opposed to externally. And that's going to create a success story and an exit for them. And we should probably be crowing about that, or they should be crowing about it in terms of creating the story. So certainly, for us, it's about need. So we're trying to grow in certain segments. We need the skill sets. We're going to go and acquire those skill sets, either the company or the people, or etc. So there's a responsibility, I suppose, for the corporates to go and find the skill sets and go and find the opportunities. But when they find it, they need to commit. They need to put the money down and show what it's worth.
Right. Let's talk about trends for a moment, because a lot of these innovators, a lot of the things they're trying to develop are informed by certain trends they're seeing in the space in which they exist. One important one that has been spoken about is mobile revolution. It is multifaceted, and it has really changed our lives. Where do you see this, and I'll start with Karl, this trend leading us in terms of how can innovators piggyback on this sort of revolution that we're having? How can they ride this wave?
Sure. I mean, it's a very broad question. So mobile is not a platform. It's an ecosystem. There are so many different parts to it. So we leverage M-Pesa extensively. So 8 out of 10 customers in Kenya that repay a product with us use M-Pesa. So we use the rails that have been created for our own business. At the same time, we could be partnering with Safaricom to do other things. So it's a much broader ecosystem. And we talk about, we spoke earlier about the solar platforms, putting a chip in, running pay-as-you-go solar, and collecting through that. So it's a very broad ecosystem, and pretty much anything we touch will go through a mobile platform.
Right. Let me just tweak it a bit. Bob, what do you think is going to disrupt this? Because we've celebrated the mobile revolution in Africa for a long time. In a sense of growth, what is going to disrupt this? What is this? We've been talking about M-Pesa for a long time. What is this next big thing?
I don't know. I think it's over the top. I met some interesting guys last week in California with a product which I think is quite interesting. It's going to allow you to trade your cash for cyber currency, as he called it. Bitcoin. Well, it's not quite Bitcoin, but it will allow you to trade your currency for cyber currency, and then to send it to a different part of the world. And it's real cash. And the other side of the world, Karl will receive the electronic cash, and then turn that back into proper cash, because at some point he needs to pay. So I think there are lots of that stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of that stuff is coming from Silicon Valley. And if we're not there we don't want to head it off, but we need to see it coming so that we can deal with it, we can adapt accordingly. But I think there are lots of stuff which you can't see coming. We didn't see WhatsApp coming, say 3 years ago. I didn't even know when WhatsApp was developed. It wasn't long ago. And now look at how much traffic WhatsApp is generating relative to SMS. There will be disruptions to voice. There will be disruptions to all those things. Life is just going to be about disruptions, and we can't be defensive about it. We have to try and anticipate them and try and roll with it if we can.
I want to open this space to our audience, but from an inspiration point of view, and we've talked about all the challenges and the situation we're in. Juliana, you've operated in this space for a very long time. How do you ensure that the next Julianas don't have it as hard as you did, that they have sort of a platform that is better for them to thrive? How do we make it better for the future?
This is how we make it better for the future, by opening up doors and making sure that we have social spaces that encourage creative learning and expression. So in 2 days at the iHub, we'll actually close the iHub, and there will be children aged 7 to 18. They will be going through a learning process where they'll be doing robotics, programming using Arduino, and whatever little parts we have together. Right. And they'll be trained by volunteers from University of Nairobi. And point is, there's a generation of young entrepreneurs right. and young innovators who, our role right now is just create space mm-hmm. and provide them with the resources and the information mm-hmm. that they need in order to be digitally literate, and not just in the way of thinking, but in the way of making. Right. So that's the first thing. The other thing that we need to do is to create space for more inclusive learning. So for example, on the ground floor of the, I'll just call it the iHub building, we're on the there's 4th floor, 3rd floor, 2nd floor, and on the ground floor, there's a group of girls called Akira Chicks. 2 of them are developers for Ushahidi, which is a global organization, but they open up doors for women from under-resourced areas of Kenya, and they teach them how to code, how to do graphic design, how entrepreneurship skills, and it really empowers and enables them to imagine a different future for themselves.
And so the Silicon Savannah becomes a movement and not a place.
We need to come up with another word. Let's not get so enamored with the silicon, I think. Right. We need to come up with another word that really embodies and includes all the different ways of creating and of being in terms of creating technology in Kenya and in Africa. Right. And it's an instructive word, yes, right. but let's not get so enamored by it and not forget that it's about people. It's about building on the talent and creating a cluster effect where we can create a pipeline of innovators for the future.
All right. Can I just add one thing to that? The other thing that she can do in order to make life easier for the next generation is to be a success. Because if she's successful, it then becomes, you know, the M word which I said I'm not going to use, yeah. but the fact that yes. product is successful in Kenya, right. it's spawned a whole environment right. that wants to copy it.
Success.
Yeah. Yes.
While we look for another word for silicon, I'll open this space to the audience. If you have your question, just shoot your question. Tell us where you're from and just brief question, please.
My name is Luke Kincaid. As we talk about homegrown innovations, I think the challenge is the pipeline of talent. And this would be for you two gentlemen. As corporates in this space, do you think that you specifically have a responsibility, a role to play with the next generation, to mentor them, to bring them up, to expose them to the types of things you're doing? And if so, how are you going about that specifically?
All right, I think we can take another one, then we answer both of them. This corner. Let's have the lady.
My name is Amrot Abdullah with Microsoft. My question is really around the startup and the monetization piece that we started talking about. The biggest challenge that we see is there are a lot of great ideas that come, but really turning those ideas into real businesses is the challenge for most developers who are thinking of creating the next big X. So as we're thinking of that, whose responsibility is that to really turn the guys who are sitting at the iHub, at NILAB, and other places to really start thinking on how to turn that idea into a dime?
All right. The first one I think was targeted at Karl and Bob, and then I think Juliana will be the best place to answer that.
Should I start? So the responsibility certainly sits with corporates to develop the pipeline. Along with, I mean, it's a much broader societal discussion, but what we do actively is involve internships. So the different levels of getting people involved. So you can start at the school level, where you expose them to some of the things you develop, and the reality is that in many cases the jobs that we had and studied for 20 years ago are not the jobs they're going to have now and not the jobs they're going to have in 15 years' time. So, I mean, who would have heard of a Twitter follower 10 years ago? I mean, that's a real job nowadays. So we follow the media. But we certainly are actively involved in internships, where we're bringing people in, whether they're straight out of school or school programs or after school after they've studied, to spend time in the environment and understand what happens. So there's certainly a lot that we can give back in terms of opening their eyes and creating a pipeline.
Bob? You know, it's always easy to say it's someone else's responsibility. That's a surefire way for failure. We all have a responsibility for it. Corporates, developers themselves. And one of the reasons why a lot of developers just get very despondent is because they think it's someone else's responsibility to make them a success. But having said that, I think we do have a role to play, not a responsibility. And you know, it's what Karl does. It's what Juliana does. We have you know, Kids Go Tech in the mornings, where we get kids from schools at Safaricom House, and we teach them how to do that kind of clever stuff. We take people as interns. We run incubation, so when we spot people who've got some talent and some potential, you know, we'll mentor them. We'll take them through, how do you write a business case? How do you manage partnerships? Because usually geeks are not great at partnerships. You know, how do you protect your IP? How do you actually plug into the big systems that we have? So we all have a role to play, but the worst thing is to think it's someone else's responsibility. It's not.
Quickly, Juliana, how do you turn this into businesses?
From idea to dime is, it's first of all the responsibility of the entrepreneur to figure out the path and the business model and how it's going to scale and how it's going to be successful. The role that innovation hubs and incubators can play is to make sure that that path, that there are connection points where they can connect with possible investors, they can connect with possible employees, they can connect with possible co-founders to get them from the idea level all the way to the dime. But there's a lot more to be done, obviously, in terms of seed funding and providing a little bit of that rocket fuel that can take a prototype from 10,000 users to 30,000 users to 500,000 users, and to help prove out the business case and the business model. So, and the responsibility for creating that pipeline or that the step-by-step really lies with all of us. And I think that's where the collaboration and the flow between the private sector, the ICT authority with the government in terms of creating a good regulatory environment where they let innovation lead and regulation to sort of follow after the innovation, to actually enable innovation and not stifle it. Regulatory environment, private sector, and then also the entrepreneurs themselves. So it's all together. We can actually create a bedrock on which the entrepreneurs can thrive and actually make a dime.
Seems like collaboration. You want to jump in? Let me just hold that. Sure. I'll give you a chance to throw that in. Let me take two more questions very quickly. Let's start from this end.
My name is Joroge and I'm an economist. My question is a bit out there. Let me start by saying M-Pesa is a great thing. And you know, it's really helped not only in business and that kind of thing, but also when it comes to when there's a crisis in the country, there's always a number that we can all donate money to and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, there's the other side of things where I know a friend who's bribed a policeman with M-Pesa and that sort of thing. So then, you know, you're providing, I guess, somewhat the good and the bad. I mean, there's a good and the bad of the service that there is. Now, what I want to ask is, because we're talking about how technology and innovation are shaping the future of East Africa, do you see a role of technology and innovation in bettering, let's say, our social capital, if you may, or bettering our values as a society, which, as you would agree, precedes a lot of great things that we would like to see in Kenya and all over Africa?
Okay.
I wanted to ask the panel whether they see crowdfunding as a possible solution to the idea to dime conundrum that we're currently facing in the tech. Thank you.
All right, so the first question was yours, Bob. The next one, we'll give it to Karl as he brings his other burning point. Let's go.
Yeah, so I think mobile money, mobile money actually helps to eradicate some of those issues. Your friend who bribed the policeman happened to bribe the rather foolish policeman because now we can catch him. Whereas if you bribe them with cash, you don't know, there's an anonymity about cash, right. Whereas there's a traceability about mobile money. So I think that and a number of ICT solutions will deal and are actively dealing with some of the ills of society.
Cool.
So we go quickly back to one point, which is I think we underestimate the value of mentorship. So moving from idea to dime. So we spoke about geeks. Bob spoke about geeks. They're great at building product. Often they aren't great at transforming that into a business. And there are many, many businessmen out there who are prepared to give up an hour, 2, 3 a week to spend time with innovators who want to build things. And the value just in terms of building a network, structuring business plans, doing forecasts, etc., I mean, that's something that should be encouraged. And the more we can create mentors for these types of businesses, the stronger the ecosystem becomes.
All right. We're bringing this to a landing, so I'll ask my panel to just have 30 seconds for your closing comments. Let's start with the lady, then we'll come to Bob and Karl.
Like I mentioned in the beginning of the segment, we're at a fantastic time to leverage homegrown innovations to solve the different problems that we have. And I think one of the things that we can do is support the different entrepreneurs wherever they are, figure out what it is they've done so far and how far, what do they need to get to the point where they can scale even more. So I think it's a really, really exciting time to be in Africa and to build in Africa.
All right.
For me, I'm kind of going to close with my opening statement, which is that, first of all, we need to recognize that we've got some of the smartest people around. I mean, especially here in Kenya. I don't mean to offend some of our other African viewers, but smartest people. Let's just understand the long-term beneficial impact of ICT and let not the regulators and the governments, and indeed some of the big companies, try and kill it before we give it a chance to really deliver.
All right. Take us home.
If you can focus on one area, which is relationships. So we, at the end of the day, we're all people. And if we have, and within corporates we have people, and I mean, Bob's shown he's been involved with IHAB and vice versa. If you find people like Juliana and you build a relationship, you'll give more and you'll get more involved. So the more we can build relationships between the various parties, I think the stronger that ecosystem becomes.
All right. I couldn't add anything more. Thank you, my panel, to that. And a lot of these conversations this afternoon are coming to the point of collaboration and convergence, and we all need to come together because this seems like we're on the same journey, just different roads. So the sooner we find each other and work together, the better. This has been the CNBC Africa World Economic Forum debate, Road to Cape Town, where we're discussing Silicon Savannah on my panel. I had Karl Westvig, who's a Chief Executive Officer at AFB. We also had Juliana Rotich, co-founder and Chief Executive and Executive Director at Ushahidi Kenya, as well as Bob Collymore, who's a Chief Executive Officer at Safaricom. My name is Bonney Tunya. Good afternoon.